And now I want to turn it over to Dr. Eric Miller, who is our keynote speaker. Eric was formerly a senior research scientist at OCLC Online Computer Library Center in Dublin, Ohio, back in the late 90s, early mid-90s, when Dublin Core started. And he was actually the co-founder and associate director of the Dublin Core Metadata Initiative. And since then, he's been a leading thinker in the area of metadata and the semantic web. He moved on from OCLC to MIT and was leading the semantic web initiative at the World Wide Web Consortium until 2007, when he went off and started his own business, Zafira, which he has been doing since then. He's done a number of things there, some of which you are probably familiar with. He partnered with the Library of Congress to develop BibFrame, and then he's currently involved with an initiative called the LibHub Initiative, which is taking BibFrame out to a set of tools that can be used for future activities. So I'm going to turn it over to Eric. Oh, nice welcome, thank you.
So it reminds me Weibull.
Exactly. So one of the things that Stu Weibull used to do at every conference was basically take a picture, and we had these at every speaking engagement early on for the early Dublin Core. Basically, these just different mosaics of watching the different groups basically sort of form that was coming from all sorts of different things. And what was actually interesting was the sort of just the diversity of the audience in terms of just where people were coming from. Coupled with the jet laggedness of where people were coming from, but it was one of the really great ways of sort of just connecting with different folks and sort of seeing the commonality that sort of existed from one meeting to another. It's actually when I was trying to basically think about what to talk about today, for an opening talk you want to sort of touch on at a certain level the themes of the particular conference, which I think you're spot on. Again, bringing all the right people together from a wide range of different communities, from a wide range of different perspectives, from a wide range of different experiences, locking them in a room and seeing what happens. This has actually been one of the tenets of the Dublin Core, and we've been very successful because of that. And in fact, what was actually really exciting is sort of looking past over the past 20 years, the sort of interesting constants that have sort of permeated across this. I mean, one of the things that's actually quite was quite novel at the time, and is still sort of continued, was a tremendous amount of these breakout groups, because the actual meetings that got started were done by not in the formal environments, but in the informal hallway conversations, where in fact all of the interesting meetings were going. But 20 years ago, that wasn't a norm. Dublin Core, as an institution, as a group, we sort of made this as part of the early unconference days. So I'm not going to do this, you've already seen this. But I want to talk a little bit about, in the context of Dublin Core, and in the context of the web, and in the context of the themes we've been talking about, a talk in three parts. I'm going to talk a little bit about the past, I'm going to talk a little bit about the present, I'm going to talk a little bit about the future. So, a little bit about the past. For whatever reason, this year seems to be the big year where everyone wants to think about anniversaries. I don't quite understand this, but 25 years ago, Tim Berners-Lee sketched up this proposal that became the web. In March, a few months ago, that was the 25th anniversary of the genesis of the web. This document was the basis for that. And it was sort of stapled to the walls at MIT for a while, and the little marginalia in the upper right-hand corner is appropriate. For those that can't read it in the background, it's basically a bit of notation from, at that time, Tim's boss, which basically, after reading it, said, vague but exciting. And that vague but exciting, now, 25 years later, we can't imagine the web. We can't imagine being without the web. Our children have grown up, and this is just a permanent part of how they basically, do school, do research, share information. But 25 years ago, we were in this situation where, because we didn't have that in our mindset, we were comparing it to the things that we knew. We were comparing it to systems that we were familiar with. That exciting aspect clear, but the path to get there was unclear. And at a certain level, that's where we're at right now with the data web. I'm getting ahead of myself, but it all starts with sort of thinking about what if. And at the second web conference, when folks were getting together to sort of talk about, we knew something was happening. So at the first web conference, there was a lot of excitement. But the second web conference, we made a turn, and we knew something was happening. There was a buzz in the air. There were tools available. It just turned a corner where it was just so exciting that it wasn't controllable by any one person or any one group or any one idea. And we were sitting around at a series of these presentations. I was giving a talk on scholarly publishing using the web. And we were sitting around, and basically folks were calculating, we have 50,000 documents out there. How are we going to ever find anything? And so I think it was the Hotel Intercontinental in Chicago. Under stairs in a darkly lit hallway with plaster sort of peeling down. Yuri Rubinsky, the gentleman over here, who was the CEO, president of a company called SoftQuad. Anyone that basically is familiar with issues of accessibility on the web, making the web possible, accessible to anyone and everyone, Yuri was one of the leading figures that made that happen. He unfortunately left us too soon, but frankly, one of the just the most formidable, nicest, amazing, intelligent people that sort of really was one of the leading aspects and one of the leading lights that made the web possible, specifically for everyone. Joseph Hardin, the other gentleman on the right, he at that time was in charge of NCSA's division where Mark Andreessen, Eric Bina, and a cast of crew were developing Mosaic. Stu, the gentleman, I always like that shot of his. I don't need to really explain to him. And I was next to him, and yes, I am that pixelated. At that time, we convinced Terry Narold, who was the director of the Office of Research, that this was actually happening. Terry was forward-thinking enough to say, let's make this a leading objective of ours. And we were very gracious to be able to, with his help, get together with a lot of folks and basically say, look, let's bring together individuals from a wide range of different disciplines. So yes, we in the library community know something about finding stuff, but let's bring together folks that are working on the low-level internet protocols that are making the web work. Let's bring together individuals that are focusing on structured document encoding and bring them together. And bring these different perspectives and listen to them and figure out a path forward that we can make it easier to find and share and discover data in that 50,000 document collection. But with the knowing that this was growing and what could we do to basically make that happen. And we had no idea that this would still be going on 20 years later. We didn't. We went back and actually, I went back to look at the early OCLC archives and all the OCLC reports and news releases and things like that. We really didn't write anything up about this at that time because we just didn't really know what we were getting into. But what we realized very quickly, bringing at least the first 42 folks together from the library community, the internet community, and the markup language communities, that interdisciplinary approach, that active listening across these different domains, that active engagement. No one could be quiet at these meetings. No one was allowed to be a lurker. Everyone participated. And that's been a very common theme throughout a tremendous amount of the conferences since. And it's been one of the cornerstones that has made Dublin Core actually so amazing. And it's amazing to see, in fact, all of you here, 20 years later. I mean, this is a huge testament in and of itself. People from all over the world flying in to talk about metadata. Let that soak in just for a second. What's equally important is how much that particular meeting and this particular initiative has had in the landscape of metadata on the web. This is an interesting diagram. Bruce, where are you? Come on, Bruce, raise your hand. There you are, Bruce. Bruce Washburn. This is actually a really nice diagram that tries to basically connect some of the continuity of how these things have evolved. There's a lot of confusion if we throw words out there on a screen like bibframe and schema and Dublin core and RDA and RDF and RD gosh. But the point is that in fact, actually these are all connected in sort of interesting ways. And Bruce did a really good job of starting to identify some of the interesting temporal patterns. You know, the folks that were involved and have taken some of these early thinkings to sort of, you know, weave them into the very fabric of standards that have been woven into the very fabric of other standards. In essence, realizing again that as all of us are here today, you know, this has been a journey that has been going on for 25 years, and the initiatives that we've started in Dublin Core, frankly, have direct impacts in a lot of the low-level technology protocols and standards that the Web Consortium has developed. It has a huge amount of impact in terms of the trajectories in which different industries, not just the library communities, but industries in general have taken, and actually have an important part to play in the direction in which the future of libraries and the future of the web of data actually can begin to coexist. So, you know, there's a lot that you know, we can do to work with Bruce to fill this out, but what was really nice about it was just starting to basically realize just the impact that the Dublin Core has had in terms of a wide range of different initiatives. And the things that, in fact, many of us sort of take for granted, or these weird slogans that have sort of shown up periodically over the past 20 years, have actually become very interesting founding principles in formalized designs in a range of different standards. Some of these terms, you know, rightly so, should be left go and go into the history books. But some of them have actually been quite important in terms of shaping our thinking here. So, I mean, there's a lot of new faces in the room, and I was extraordinarily excited, Mike, when you basically you know, highlighted all the folks that were on the sort of first time here. But can I get a quick raise of hands? Who is the, you know, for those that are the first time in the Dublin Core, one more time? Oh, this is awesome, guys. All right. So, all right, for those that were in the front of the seat, do that again, and everybody turn around and look. Okay. All right, just look at the numbers here. I mean, that's a really good sign of some pretty healthy activity, and actually really excited as, you know, an indicator for the success of this kind of trajectory. But for those that are sort of, you know, raising their hands for the first time, I'm going to just tie together a few quick silly slogans and what their impact are. So 20 years ago, we were dealing with metadata standards and metadata structures in which, in essence, folks were having to think, in order to build a standard, we have to build this huge monolithic set of vocabulary and structures that encompasses everything. And every standard that we build has to be weighed by a bathroom scale. And in fact, everything that we build has to be encompassing for all of the particular audience. So much that actually it makes this sound, you know, when we drop it. It's that, you know, voluminous of a standard that has to basically be in place. One of the things that the Dublin Core has basically recognized sort of, you know, 20 years ago was, in fact, actually lighter weight standards and modules of vocabularies can actually coexist quite nicely. We can actually make simple vocabularies that are important for discovery, and they have these extended by different communities over time. That was a radically different notion of approaching this particular problem at that time. It came up with phrases like Warwick framework and the dumbed down rule, and, you know, these phrases that we started introducing to help ourselves understand this. But the notion that one standard, you know, to serve everyone was a real challenge. And then, in fact, we could break these up and come up with frameworks of standards that could most effectively be combined. And that we didn't have to have one standard to rule them all was a really, really radical change at that time. And it was hammered out in terms from the library's perspective and how we could do it from a technology perspective, and how we could represent it in a markup perspective. And that's been an interesting permutation and progression that has that has basically woven itself into the minds of metadata designers over the past 20 years. I'm not going to really sort of go through the rest of these things, but I want to highlight one of the last things, application profiles. RDF validation, data shapes, spin, the notion of being able to sort of say, this is the set of RDF that I need to solve a particular problem. This is becoming increasingly mainstream in a lot of decisions and a lot of discussions that are happening right now. And over the course of the next couple days, you'll hear a lot about this in terms of what's actually happening with different groups. But one of the interesting aspects that the Dublin Core has also basically provided is sort of really not only bringing together the set of practitioners, but because of that, being able to look beyond where the rest of the industry is at and think about what is coming next and what's needed next. In fact, we were discussing application profiles in the Dublin Core community, I believe as early as Tom and us driving to Ottawa in 2000. Right, 14 years ago. That's embarrassing for us, isn't it? Sorry. But it was, but it wasn't because we were terribly smart. It wasn't because, we had 14 hours in the car together. It was because as practitioners starting to use these technologies, you start to be able to understand where their limitations are, and you start to think about how to basically address solutions to that. And so now, in fact, part of the reason a lot of different groups are starting to realize this is actually an important area is because at a certain level, they're catching up to the library and metadata community that sort of has been thinking about this for quite some time. And we're going to see increasingly these kind of ideas woven into the very fabric of standards, and our job is to now then take these back and integrate them into the mainstream applications. I was trying to sort of capture some of the early design aspects that permutated the community and the creative tension that we had early on in this, and I couldn't quite basically nail it. And I went back actually to Dan Brickley's keynote a couple years ago, because I think he did actually a really good job actually capturing something that I couldn't articulate, but in a way that I think is just spot on. We had a really interesting creative tension that I think still to this day is actually important to recognize. And it's not a bad thing that it's a tension. It's actually quite a good thing. And Dan, I think, did just a brilliant job recognizing that there's this simple vocabulary semantics pragmatism. This notion that we don't want to spend a lot of time over-engineering something, that basically we need something that we can actually use now. But at the same time, we need it to be able to, on the second side of it, that one vocabulary can't capture it all. We need it to be able to evolve. We need it to be able to refine and extend this, and to allow other people to build on top of it. And that kind of creative tension, again, was very novel at the time, but it really was a very interesting and powerful way that summed up a lot of, another phrase that we used to throw around a lot at the Dublin Core, which is, make the simple things simple and the complex things possible. And when we start talking about profiles and we start talking about these principles of new things that we in the Dublin Core need to be focusing on, I'd like us to continue, if possible, that kind of creative tension between those two kinds of pragmatic views. There are simple things that we want to do. We do not want to over-engineer them to the point of not being able to do those simple things. But we also want to engineer things in a simple way that allows them to be extended, refined, and evolve over time. One of the things that was also a key part of the early Dublin Core, and one of the things that actually is important to recognize here, and one of the things that I think sometimes gets lost, is that while we were developing standards, the real value of what the Dublin Core provided was a social one, the community around it. It was a safe place that different stakeholders could come together and bang out ideas. It was a place where folks in the library community, the metadata, in the museum community, the archive community, the e-learning community, could sort of come together and work out their differences. No other place existed, and still to this day, arguably, no other place exists where those kinds of different perspectives can come together. We've laid a lot of infrastructure since then in terms of open standards and enabling technologies, and we've learned a lot in the process. But one of the things that I think is just important to keep remembering here is it's not a product that's we deliver products, but the products we delivered 20 years ago might be very different than the products of today. But it's that social process that we've provided, that infrastructure, that community-driven, consensus-driven framework that allows weaving the best of these various stakeholders, the data that we manage in the web, weaving that together. That's in fact what I think is the most value over the past 20 years. If it was just a product, we wouldn't be here still. And at a certain level, frankly, we just need to recognize that as a community of practitioners, we're way ahead of our time. There's a lot of people basically catching up. But in fact, new norms happen extremely fast. 20 years ago we were talking about and screaming about the value of data, and how data was king, and how data was going to revolutionize everything. And then like a few seconds later, data scientist commands $100,000. You just change your business card, and all of a sudden that becomes sort of a selling point. No one knows what that is, but the fact that this has become so quickly mainstream is actually quite an interesting change. I mean, in the past couple of years, you have seen a huge, huge, huge sea change in terms of the business value of data and the business that are associated with this. And in fact, this is actually a wonderful time for us to sort of rise up at a certain level, because as these new memes are occurring and as these new interests are becoming absolutely clear, and as people start scratching the surface and sort of saying, gosh, I really don't know what a data scientist is. This is actually when they are in fact turning to the data practitioners and professionals, and in fact libraries, to help basically get a sense of what that really, really means. So, from the past perspective, building on our strengths, I'm talking a little bit here on our future, but we've identified at a certain level in the process of what we do, a couple key things that basically I would tease out from looking at the particular conference, and I want to sort of highlight as we look to the future of libraries and the future of Dublin Core. The application profiles work in particular, I think, is going to be critical for Dublin Core to basically step into. And the linked data patterns that provide consistency across cultural heritage institutions is one that I think we're going to have to be very focused on as well. And we have an opportunity to basically bring together the right stakeholders and really sort of own this space in a way that no other institution has been able to step up to. Now, I'm going to bring us to the present and talk a little bit about why I think that's important. All right. So in the context of the present, I'd like to basically talk about the web. I mean, at a certain level, that's a bit old hat. Again, the web has sort of become so much of a commonplace that sort of talking about how cool it is kind of is boring. I mean, I do remember actually talking to a bunch of fourth graders about something completely different. My PhD work is in geography, so I was talking about maps. And one of the teachers basically found out what I did for a day job, and they sort of said, well, tell us a little bit about that. And which that translated into this, would you like to see our fourth grade webpage? Because that was the big thing that they had just figured out doing. And they were really excited about this. And it was cool because they were connecting with their webpage with other fourth graders around the world. And it was a really exciting, they were really proud of it, and they should be. I mean, it was a really cool thing. And then one of these girls basically sort of asked, because the girls seem to actually be more inquisitive at that age than boys. Well, maybe forever. But the point is, one of them sort of said, what did your website look like when you were our age? And, and you were just like, well, after I carved it out of stone. But it is. I'm actually really still excited about the web, and there's, I think, strong reasons why. In part because it basically, it serves a very important purpose. I mean, it is the most successful communication platform ever conceived. It has basically provided ways in which those fourth graders could connect with each other in ways that, us working early on in the standards could have never basically comprehended. But the promise of the web, as it increasingly becomes the most pervasive data management and data integration, the way in which we can basically use it to accelerate scholarly communication and learning, decision making, educating the communities around us, sharing data in a web environment to address, extraordinarily, huge problems that any one person or any one organization can't do. Climate change, cancer, AIDS. These are things that we have. With the combination of the web as an architecture and with the combination of people, we can basically live the promise of this web moving forward. And what's happening right now in the very aspect of the current present is the recognition that right now most of the web pages are really in fact designed for people. They're really designed for humans to in fact look at this. And if we look at that as a human, we basically get a lot out of this. But from a machine perspective, machines can't quickly act on this information. What we see in terms of a big bold headline or an italics name, what we see that might be a title or what we know is an author, or we know is a publication date, to a machine is bold, underlined, italics, etc. The meaning that we make isn't conveyed in a way that the applications, the search engines, etc., can pick up on. That is changing. That is changing in a very fast, accelerated way. The new norm is moving from not just a human-readable web, but to a machine-actionable web. Both of these things simultaneously. A credit card has been doing this for decades. The notion of being able to have something that we, the humans, understand, but in the back of it, it allows us quickly to drain our pocketbooks and wallets and bank accounts faster than we ever thought was possible. Yeah, someone's laughing a little too much there, right? I mean, that's, yeah. My 13-year-old and Xbox is a great example of this. And underpinning, all of that are low-level standards and technologies that are horribly named. And I'm sorry for that. But this is about making the data web possible and making these smaller atomic building blocks of data possible, so that we can begin to snap together these actionable data that we combine from different parts of the web and create something greater than the sum of their parts. The little RDF logo from a standpoint of a child's toy is actually quite appropriate in the terms that the child's toy has engineering tolerances of that of an internal combustion engine. That's what makes those little satisfying clicks when you snap them together. And in fact, the RDF, or the Legos from 50 years ago, actually snap together with the Legos of today, because even though they've been packaged in different ways for different price points, and now completely owned by different brands that are trying to sort of move these into the Star Wars themes, or the Knights of the Round Table themes, or the Jacques Cousteau themes for different audiences all over the world, they still basically follow those same engineering tolerances and those same principles that allow them to be combined and snapped together. And this provides a basis for that both human readable and machine actionable web. And a lot of the underlying standards and technologies that this group has developed early on in Dublin 4 went into the development of these particular things. And it was in part also taking advantage again of the lessons that we've learned here from the web. Not just making data more actionable, but empowering people to actually do interesting things with this data. I'm going to go ahead of myself here. So I think everyone's basically heard the CAPTCHA story. Everyone knows what the CAPTCHA, yeah, everyone knows. ReCAPTCHA, yes? The notion here that in short, together by basically not only sort of indicating to a machine that we are in fact human and not a machine, we can actually type in the words that we see and together translate large corpuses of information. So our cultural heritage information, in essence of developing countries, is still in print. We can do bounding boxes around those words. Those bounding boxes get shipped into ReCAPTCHA. We type those in, and collectively we are translating all of these scanned images of our cultural heritage. And that data is being increasingly made available to everyone. But it's this notion of doing small things as humans, but in a way that gets combined together, that reconstructs the entire New York Times archive in 8 months, and all thanks to you. The notion of being able to take these small building blocks and the power of people to create new and interesting things is a very powerful one. These two individuals clearly have more time on their hands than they should, but the point is the fact of reassembling and creating these new interesting shapes from these small atomic building blocks in essence, is what linked data is about. So all these underlying standards and technologies to make the web more machine actionable is really about creating a framework for sharing and connecting the data using the web as a platform. Now, in the context of that story, I'd like to talk about a tale of two webs, because this is what I believe is happening right now. This is the visible web. For the most part, I'm going to reduce the visible web into two images. Both of these services are built, in essence, from you. I'm going to break one down and try to, we throw words around here quite frequently. We do this in Dublin Core. We do it, as humans. I'd like to basically break the difference down between search and discovery. So search is an example on the Google side. You type something in and you get something back. And there's been a lot of advances in search, and we're going to talk about some of them today, and you're going to hear a lot of them over the next couple days. There's actually been a lot of advances on discovery. Facebook's an example of this. One, you're basically gathering up all the web, typing things in, trying to find out what you can find in terms of search engines. The other, Facebook, is actually, you recognize there's a lot of things going on out there at once. There's huge amounts of information. But the only things that I'm going to be paying attention to are those that I've basically chosen that I trust. So of the wide range of things that are going on, I'm only going to be seeing things that, in fact, are available through my friends, or my family, or folks that I work with, or folks that I collaborate with in various projects. I've segmented the web and all of the things that are going on to basically just to a stream of information that is filtered through a trusted lens that I've created. Again, both of these systems basically are predicated on exactly the same architecture. Both of these systems are incredibly helpful in terms of disseminating and sharing information. But both of these systems do this, again, from a slightly different approach, all based on the same information and architecture. I can type in the phrase Albert Einstein, a string. On the left-hand side, I get a tremendous amount of information back relative to things that are most popular about that string. On the right-hand side, I've got an information in which data from lots of different sources has been aggregated to give me information about one particular interpretation of that string as a person. So on the left-hand side is the traditional kind of search results. On the right-hand side is, in essence, what Google calls a global knowledge graph, which was built off of, a few years ago, an acquisition for MetaWeb and Freebase. In essence, a big RDF storage layer that allowed different information to be aggregated together and in a pretty cool and interesting way. This is a very interesting power of using the web as a search paradigm. And in fact, you're going to hear in the next couple days, if you haven't already, of some great work that Google, Bing, Yandex, Yahoo, and a few other folks have come together to say, this is how we're going to actually take some of those early standards, mark them up in a web page, and improve those search results, which is awesome. And I want to basically bookmark just how important that is as we start moving forward. I'm going to flip back here to Facebook for a second. In particular, I'm frankly, just to be clear, not a huge fan of Facebook. But what I am actually a fan of is big, large graphs of data. And if anyone has actually played with the graph search aspect of Facebook, this is a great example of what can happen with big graphs of data. Just quickly, has graph search shown up? I mean, people play with this yet? Yeah, oh come on, you have to have played with this more. It's actually both cool and scary at the same time. All right, but here, let me just sort of quickly go through this. Find me all my friends that like Albert Einstein. Find me people that like Albert Einstein near me. Find people that know something about physics, which is inferred by basically liking Albert Einstein. There is no set number of queries that we can basically put inside of the graph search. It, in fact, builds off of how we start linking to different resources. By saying that you live at a particular place, it can basically figure out what it means by near me. By choosing an IP address of where you're doing, it actually knows what you're near. I can actually type in, find me people that like Albert Einstein near me, and it picks up all the people here in Texas. This is what happens when we start creating graphs of data and start basically putting in places really interesting open search capabilities to explore this. It opens up new ways in which, in fact, discovery and search can coexist. And in fact, it's a continuum between discovery and search. But the thing that is common among all of this is the web as an architecture. And what we're seeing in a very quiet way, and one that I think we need to be a little bit more aware of, is what I would characterize as the identifier wars. So, take it a little bit back to history. The phrase browser wars resonate with anyone? It was a horribly bloody time. It was terrible tragedies occurred. It was this very it was horrible. The point is, different browser manufacturers were trying to compete, and people were trying to basically compete for mind share. And that was an important part of defining sort of the future of how the web evolved. After the browser wars, in fact, we had what was generally referred to as the search engine wars, which was also bloody, but at a certain level, quieter in terms of its bloodiness. But in fact, actually, at a certain level as well, we, the consumers, win in this, right? Because what we're seeing is a tremendous amount of, really amazing advances in search technology that we, the consumers, are sort of taking advantage of, which is actually, very interesting in that regard. But it was a very, very interesting time of consolidation and normalization and, some large degree of nastiness. What I believe is what's happening very quietly right now is what I would characterize as the identifier wars. When I say I like Albert Einstein, and we recognize that basically we have different identifiers for Albert Einstein, which identifier I use for Albert Einstein actually becomes a very important one to consider. By liking Albert Einstein, like 28 million people do in Facebook, that's a different identifier than what Google Knowledge Graph's version of Albert Einstein is. And frankly, that's a different identifier than VOP, or id.loc.gov, or any other authority service that we in the library community might be coming up with. The reason that these discovery and search engine platforms are trying to get these identifiers out there and have people link to them is because the more people that link to them, the more they understand the context in which people relate. The more valuable services they create, the more targeted advertising they can create, the more business intelligence can be gleaned. Which is all actually quite good until we realize how that data may or may not be used. But once we learn that, it's too late. So it's not, from an underlying standards technology standpoint, the ability of providing identifiers and how people link to that is actually a really powerful one. What's happening right now is a bit of an accelerant, trying to figure out, get them to link to me. And this is, again, a nice little diagram that tries to basically explain an extraordinarily powerful but complicated way in which the web actually works in terms of relevance ranking. This is called PageRank. Basically, it says the value of a particular resource is proportionate to the number of things that link to it. So the more things that link to me, the more valuable I am. And this is, in fact, actually how Facebook at a certain level does its graph search, and how Google does its relevant ranking, and how, frankly, search engines in general basically deliver results based on, in essence, not really the markup, even though that's an important part of it, but the linkages that exist between these things. And I need to turn this off. And what's happening right now is, in this context of the identifier wars and this identifier landscape, the things that are easy to link to win. And the things that are trusted, this actually is, that's, for those that can't see that little small bottom box is trust. And frankly, that's too big for this slide. Easy wins in this space. If it's easier to link to something, that you will. If I have to basically dig hard to link to something, I won't. In essence, which identifiers I link to is an artifact of how easy it is to basically link to them. And Google and Facebook right now are making it extraordinarily easy to link to things. We in the library, museum, and archive community are making it actually quite difficult to link to things. I'm getting ahead of myself, and I'll talk a little bit about that as well. So let me flip now. I talked a little bit about the visible web. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about the invisible web. The invisible web, in short, is the library community. Sorry, that's us. We actually have a tremendous amount of information that is, in fact, just simply not viewable by the web. That can't be a news to us, and yet it still seems to be. But what folks have actually done, and this is actually quite important to recognize, is sort of taking a step back and saying, look, not only are library standards not on the web, but they're not of the web. And in fact, by weaving the future of library standards into the very fabric of the web, we can actually increase visibility and discovery of the things that we curate. And we can actually accelerate that curation in ways that, frankly, we just haven't been able to see those kinds of economies of scale otherwise. So I'm not going to go into a huge discussion on BibFrame. You're going to basically hear about that in other sessions later in this conference. But I want to highlight a few key points that are important in this discussion of the visible and invisible web. So first and foremost, we talk about BibFrame in a bibliographic framework. But the reality is we're trying to basically design something that literally is both capturing the content in which we've created over the past 40 years, but to go back to the early Dublin core discussion, flexible enough that it can evolve for the next 40 years as well. That's no easy task. We're not talking about libraries. We're talking about the larger memory organization space. When my child has a report to do on Abraham Lincoln, he is not thinking about going to the library to find information about that, and the archive, and the museum. Guess what? He's thinking about Google. Right? The institutional boundaries that we have around memory organizations are artificial to the users we serve. And the ability to break those barriers down is what this is trying to do. And finally, and most importantly, and perhaps most unclearly, again, not just using the web as a delivery mechanism, but being very much of the web. That's a very important distinction, and it is very unclear. But in short, it's about using the web identifiers, using the way the web talks as a way of representing the data that we in the library, museum, and archive community are curating. So in the context of those Legos, if you go to the BibFrame site, one way of characterizing what's being developed there is just a whole bunch of Legos. And there's a lot of them, because basically trying to represent a lot of the past 40 years is kind of painful. MARC as a standard has been one of the longest, it has been the longest interchange standard of any industry. It has grown, it has adapted, it has morphed, it's grown a third arm. I mean, it has basically done things because the community has basically done this. And it's reached a point where, in fact, it's not evolving in an effective and efficient way. But trying to basically think about how to reflect that in the web is a non-trivial task. And BibFrame is an attempt to basically take on that non-trivial task. Of the various different standards and the various different drafts and the various different documents and thoughts around there, one of these is related to the discussion at hand, and one of the things that I think actually the Dublin core can help significantly move forward. And this is this notion of being able to take subsets of those Legos and do interesting things with them. In fact, we don't need to basically have all the Legos to build interesting shapes. We just need to be very clear about some of the shapes that we're interested in. And the profile work can be thought of as sort of taking parts of those Legos and assembling them in small, digestible, useful shapes in a way that very specialized, very specific communities can benefit from. Now, I'm not going to basically tell you which one of these things might be RDA. Angry Bird. Which one of these things might be simpler than others? Which one of them might be more useful than others? What I'm trying to say is that, in fact, we can take some of these building blocks and assemble them for very specific uses and connect to the people that basically need it, rather than trying to sort of game the system, which is our current status quo in terms of status quo, in terms of MARC. And the profile work that basically is being discussed in BidFrame is directly built on the profile work that was basically being discussed 14 years ago from Dublin Core. If anything, the way I would characterize it is actually the profile work in BidFrame is actually more relaxed. It's less about constraints. It's less about validation. It's more about packaging. And frankly, packaging, best practices, consensus goes a long way in terms of consistency. Guess what? MARC has no validation inside of it. So BidFrame Profiles gives us a common model. BidFrame gives us a common model to start doing this. And one of the things I want to sort of make a point about BidFrame as a common model, for 2 months prior to designing BidFrame, we looked around at all of the linked data implementations that different national libraries, regional libraries, museums, archives, etc. were doing. We queried APIs, we looked at the patterns inside of the data, we tried to do frequency distribution over the vocabularies we were using, we tried to see if we were identifying common patterns. Guess what? The only common pattern that we could really identify was that everyone called it linked data. Dublin Core was used a lot in terms of its namespace, but the consistency in which Dublin Core was used, there was none. DC Creator had a range of a URI, DC Creator had a literal, DC Creator had a literal that inside of it had HTTP : ... Right. So trying to build systems that combine this information, they were all linked data, but they were all not linkable. So part of what we were trying to do in BidFrame is identify those things that were common patterns. Not introducing new patterns, but could we identify common patterns across these things? As a way of sort of saying, look, there's been a lot of precedence and a lot of work. Can we come up with a common way in which we could map from what we're existing doing to the minimal subset, to then start combining this together and build off of the network effect in which libraries, museums, and archives actually have a huge possibility of leading? So we might not like some of the design patterns in BidFrame. We might not like BidFrame at all. I know some of you don't. But the point is that we need to get past this. Because what's at stake is too important. We need to figure out ways in which we can take some of these principles and take some of these patterns and reflect our data in a way that maximizes their use. And that's what these blueprints do. So I want to talk briefly about a project that we did with the National Library Board of Singapore and how this fits together. And this is my poor attempt at basically describing this. But it's similar for those that are familiar with cascading style sheets with BidFrame profiles. The notion here is, in the context of the National Library Board of Singapore, what we were tasked to do was, can you come up with a linked data architecture that integrates all of our stuff? And everyone basically, that's a challenging problem, especially in that context where the National Library Board of Singapore now basically has the National Museum and the National Archives as part of its institutional ownership. So in essence, how do you basically make it possible to tie together monographs, serials, music, rare books, videos, archives, images, etc., all which basically, surprisingly, have different data formats, and all which, surprisingly, have different data standards? And can we magically make this into one possible system that we can deliver effective services and solutions to our users? It sounds fun. It's actually really tough. So part of the approach that we did to trying to solve this is we went back to some of the principles of the Dublin Core, the Warwick framework, the Singapore framework, the notion of building these modules of descriptive assets and basically combining them and they're declarative mappings in a way that we could actually use and map things together. And it came out actually, I mean, from a validation point of the importance of the Warwick framework and the Singapore framework, you know, this is only one example, and you can't draw any conclusion from this. But the notion of being able to take a set of Legos that represent a bib frame light, you know, a core vocabulary that supports those patterns, layer them with a set of vocabularies that support the description of monographs, and layer that, the set of vocabularies that support rare books and manuscripts, and have that cascade very nicely, was a very powerful one for us. And it allowed us a great degree of flexibility and adaptation and customization, working with the data providers and the data experts to make quick changes and say, is this what you mean? And not have round, you know, monthly or weekly or yearly loops of that dialogue. Quick changes, 2, 3, 4 lines of changes to the rules. Regenerate, is this what you mean? No, no, I meant it this way. And it became a very agile, very experimental, very fun process. And it was in part possible because we were able to use the patterns that we had in linked data, use some of the vocabulary that we had in BibFrame, layer these vocabularies based on what we learned from Dublin Core, and put these together into an iterative, agile process that we could work with the data experts and say, is this what you meant? That turned out to be an incredibly helpful and interesting and enjoyable process. We'll see where it goes. As we've been having these discussions with linked data, and as we've been having the discussions with BibFrame, and as we've been talking with libraries all over the world, one of the things that we basically were told pretty consistently is, what's the impact this has with me? How do I learn more about this? You tell me about these profiles. Where can we go learn more about this? What does it mean? What does linked data mean? So we actually started a few months ago, in essence, a training offering around this. And these are the folks that are basically either have gone through the training or are currently going through the training. And the discussion that comes around in the profile is, how do I construct these? And we can give them a technical answer for that. The BibFrame specification that was cited on the Library of Congress site is an example of that. The challenge that we have in answering this question is that there is no social process we can point folks to. I want to build a profile of e-learning. Looking at you, Stuart. I want to build a profile around e-learning. Where do I go to do that? Right? There is an opportunity for the Dublin Core, not to create more elements, but to help communities come together and package these in a way that basically serves a particular purpose. Put a name to them and help people basically move forward. These ideas are permeating. These understandings, these practical applications are becoming increasingly clear. The question that is being asked is, how do I create these in a way that others will basically also find valuable? So let me go back again. These are some of the tools that, in fact, I'm not going to spend too much time on this. So one of the things that we do in this training is we give people tools. And these tools basically allow people to load or point at or upload or add data of their particular, that's in their repository, that's in their data set. Right now, basically, the idea is to sort of say, look, you understand your data better if you look at your data. And this tool basically helps them go from a set number of different kinds of formats into BibFrame and understand really what the implications of that are. So I'm not going to spend too much time on that because I'll run out. But one of the things that we sort of provided, you know, first and foremost, when folks were sort of saying, look, I want to do the due diligence. I want to make sure nothing gets lost. I want to make sure that if I convert Mark to BibFrame, I don't lose anything, which assumes the fact that you know what the heck you've got. And here's, you know, people don't. I mean, some people do. Where's Jackie Shea? Jackie knows everything that she has in her OPAC. She is remarkable in that regard. Where are you, Jackie? I know you're here. Anyways, if you tell her, she'll tell you what she's got, and it's quite remarkable. But for everybody else, What we gave is sort of a set of tools that helps basically say, look, this is the frequency distribution of the mark tags that you're using. These are the kinds of information that you have based on the quantitative analytics of the fields that you use. So you can basically get a shape, an indication of whether you're using Roman or non-Roman characters by different kinds of mark fields that are being thrown in there. You can get a sense if you've got an overwhelming number of customizations by different kinds of 900 or X9 or 9XX kinds of fields. You can get a different kind of distribution depending on the kind of, are you using mark relator codes? And if so, what kind of frequencies? So this was really a way in which basically people could get a better understanding of this. And this was a way of basically showing what this data might look like in a linked data environment. But one of the things that it's also useful for is actually helping people understand, if I go from marked records into these linked datable resources, what does that really mean? So in this particular case, I'm loading close to 200 NLM records. I shred these into roughly 1,400 linkable resources. And helping people understand the notion of going from a record to a resource, this is a small but important step to help people go forward with this. So let me go back to this particular slide. The value of something is proportionate to the number of things that link to it. We are moving from 200 mark records into roughly 1,400 resources. The distribution of those resources is over on the left-hand side. This is just an example of somebody's data. I'm breaking this into topics. I'm breaking this into people. I'm breaking this into organizations. I'm breaking this into places. I'm breaking this into genres. I'm breaking these into collections. I'm deconstructing mark records into these kind of linkable assets. We're not talking about linking mark records together when we talk about linked data in libraries. We're talking about linking to the resources in which the mark records are in fact hiding. And in the process of linking to those resources and building off of each other's links, we're talking about increasing the visibility of these things far more than we could have ever imagined. So I want us to stop thinking about, I don't really care if we think about records or resources. I'd like us not to talk about triples. But what I want us to start thinking about are things that we can link to and ways in which we can make those linking easier. And ways in which we can make the trusted assets of the linking things that we've got not only more linkable, but more trustworthy in a larger network environment. And to move from an identifier land grab where it's just pointed at things that are easy to new ways in which we can basically make our identifiers as easy to link to as everyone else's. Google Refine, just a tool. This is a tool everyone should basically play with, folks. All right? This is, sorry, it's Open Refine now. I'm sorry. My bad. It's a data cleaning tool. It helps you clean up your data. It's actually really, really, really helpful. But one of the things that it basically provides is the ability to do reconciliation. I've got a spreadsheet of authors. In essence, I want to basically normalize the names around those authors. Or I want to get additional information about those authors. I know that this is in fact a person's name. It's not a spreadsheet in a column that's just a text. It's a person's name. I want to basically match those against authority files and get more information about them. This is a tool that allows that kind of reconciliation to be possible. Our authority services don't interface with these kind of tools. We don't make it easy for these kind of tools to in fact actually get used. We don't make it easy for our identifiers to be used by these kind of tools. This is a prototype that we developed a while back to help sort of, describe the art of the possible of what cataloging environments might look like in a more linked data space. You type things in, and basically it queries across dozens of different authority services and help you match the term that basically makes sense to you. So I'm typing carcinoma, and basically I'm getting hits back from Agravoc, which is the FAO's linked data service, and OCLC's FAST service. Just an example. We're working right now with the National Library of Medicine to help them put on place mesh as a linked data service. So now if you start typing carcinoma, you'll actually get more mesh terms as well. We're working with the World Health Organization to help them put up ICD-11, which is the International Classification of Diseases. Start typing these things, you can basically start hitting it. We, as a community, are building up these wonderful identity services. But we as a community are doing a horrible job of letting people link to those identity services that we are creating. We love identifiers more than any other community I've been able to work with. And yet we have this tendency to try to put up, extraordinarily high barriers for this. If you only use our API, our API is the best. Okay. But best is the enemy of good. And right now, good goes a long way. So what we're trying to do, and what I think is another opportunity for the Dublin Core, is to help identify these patterns in these linked data solutions, these partial solutions, and recommend best practices and best ways in which these kinds of things can be linkable. They're almost micro patterns. We're not after full-blown vocabularies here. We're not after full-blown descriptions. We're not after, over-engineered solutions. Just small patterns to say, this is how I would link to a resource. And these are the kind of simple APIs that basically go a long way. There's nothing wrong with building additional, richer APIs on top of that. There's nothing wrong with basically also providing your custom APIs that do amazing things for your customers. But simple patterns go a long way in making your data more linkable. If we look at then, in the context of the invisible web and the standards and the technologies and a lot of the infrastructure we've got in place, if we look at this from sort of a purpose and promise standpoint, as we started out, the web has both purpose and promise. From an invisible web standpoint, from a library linked data standpoint, at a certain level, the purpose of BibFrame is to replace MARC. The promise is in fact so much more. The purpose is in fact serving libraries. The promise is in fact extending beyond libraries to related memory organizations, the vendors, up and down the food chain, and ultimately, frankly, the users in which they serve. It is not an us versus them proposition. We are not making this data and then throwing it over. Our users are valuable contributors to this space. I have a problem of collecting vinyl records. That is the first step of 12 one takes, is to acknowledge that problem. The data that comes from the library about music is not to the level of detail that I find useful in terms of my interest in finding stuff that I want. I'm interested in any vinyl record that was recorded by Rudy Van Gelder. Anything he's done. Gospel, jazz, I don't care. One of the best recording artists known to man. That information is hidden. If we, as a library community, make that information of just the albums that are available, there are thousands of people that would just love to add value to that data and basically help describe those resources in a way that myself and others would find really interesting. The point is that this is a cooperative opportunity for us, not only to work within and across memory organizations, but in fact the users in which we serve as a way of contributing back. So the purpose, again, from BibFrame in the context of leveraging existing web standards to speak with a consistent voice. The promise is about bridging the visible and the invisible web, about exposing our assets in a way that the web understands, about exposing our assets where the users are. All right, so I got a few more minutes and I'm just going to wrap up in the future. And I always like this. Frankly, anyone that basically says what the future looks like, I don't really trust them. So, with that caveat, you should probably not trust me. But I'm going to offer something nevertheless. And I'm going to say what the future is at a certain level. We as an industry have done a tremendous amount of things, but this is one of the things that I don't give us high marks for right now. For the past 20 years, we have been basically talking about the ability of surfacing data on the web, about making it easier for folks to find things, making it easier for folks to discover our assets, and we haven't done an extraordinarily decent job of this overall. A for effort, but our execution we could improve on. If I search for The Great Gatsby, I literally still have 60 pages to go before I get to a library. This was a search done prior to the movie coming out. Now that the movie coming out, I actually quit at page 100. I'm sorry. I don't know anybody who goes to page 60, let alone to page 100 to try to find a search result. The point is that, in fact, of the assets that we have, the people using the web to find them can't. In fact, a lot of the work that we're doing right now on the vocabulary is huge, and a lot of the efforts that we, in a variety of different industries, by a variety of different vendors and a variety of different initiatives have done, is important. We are actually taking very important steps to describe our assets, but they're still islands of descriptive information. In fact, we harvest, as a search engine, this linked data, but these become very isolated, interesting, individual data assets. Yes, I can basically harvest The Great Gatsby as a book. It is available in the results set. But the fact that we don't have a lot of things linking to this means it's basically in page 60. So we can describe the fact that it's a book, not a website. That's an important step. But we're not increasing the visibility of these things. It's a good step to start creating relational links between these assets and institutions that hold them. But remember, the value of something on the web is proportionate to the number of things that link into it, not out of it. The number of things that link into it increases its popularity. The number of things that link out of it has marginal impact in terms of this. In fact, what a better solution is from a visibility and discovery is having a lot of things, in fact, point into it. So if we have a lot of websites that basically are part of a life sciences SEO campaign, and you pay 100 websites to link to your diabetes drug, when somebody searches for diabetes, they get, increasingly your results. We have 20,000 libraries in the US alone. If we had 10% of those libraries pointing at the same thing, we would have an SEO campaign that rivals any industry. And that's an SEO campaign and an SEO strategy of circa 2007. But it's still huge for us. It's still enormous for us. It's still a wonderful way of increasing the connectivity and the awareness of things so that more people start to create things. Linked data, these standards, these technologies, a lot of the stuff that we basically are talking about right now is the key for this. It is amazing what's happening right now in the web, and I'm going to talk about the impact here it has in the future. These technologies, in fact, are not something specific to library. They're not something specific to our industry. They actually happen right now. The reason I can search for a Dell laptop and not get every particular company that basically sells that is because none of the search engines want the front page to be dominated by any one domain, which is fine. So things like consolidation occur. And instead of basically having every company that serves Dell laptops that points to the same thing, you could basically consolidate this and kick off to a new aggregate that says, shop or shop near me, or et cetera, et cetera. There is nothing stopping us, just ourselves, from having the exact same thing happen in the library industry. And we're not asking anyone to do anything special. We're just talking in a way the web understands. What's the most exciting about this is that, in fact, all of the pieces seem to be coming into place. So the underlying web standards that we've been talking about and developing and designing for the past 18 years actually are maturing and becoming increasingly commonplace across the board. The dark web, the invisible web, the web of library, museum, and archive information are increasingly being predicated on these linked data standards. We're missing an opportunity about execution, about publishing, but the standards that we're discussing are in this vein, and in fact are poised extraordinarily well to take advantage of these trajectories. The front-end search engines are actually able to consume this in a way. We talk about schema.org as a vocabulary, and it is a very important one, but it's a constantly moving trajectory. But the reason it's able to constantly move is because underpinning this are a lot of these linked data technologies, and it allows that evolution, in fact, to actually occur pretty quickly. If we on the back end can produce and manage this data in a way that the front end can consume, and the most important thing, because many of us have been talking about this for 20 years, from the hundreds of libraries that we've been talking to, the industry seems ready for this. Folks are, in fact, willing to put up their hand. People, money, time, energy to basically make libraries a visible part of the web. So imagine if we basically, if I search for these assets and I search for Austin Public Library, Harry Potter, I don't get Overdrive. I don't get, Company X. I get Austin Public Library. The ability of describing libraries in a way that the web can understand and describing their assets that basically drive people back and the mind share back to the value of libraries is what folks seem to be ready for and what these standards and enabling technologies provide. And we believe fundamentally that the ability to weave libraries back into those search results weaves the credibility that we in libraries have in a physical environment back into a virtual one. And that's in part what LibHub is all about. It is about learning, leading, and linking and helping libraries come together to understand the impact of these technologies on the invisible and visible webs and to give them the tools and technologies and wherewithal and capabilities of describing themselves, their assets, and how they link to each other, with the notion of sort of increasing their visibility first, and then as we start to cross-link, increase the discovery across all libraries. And building off of the cooperative nature that is libraries. We, in the library community, are the most cooperative of any industry that I've been fortunate to work with. We're also one of the least efficient in our cooperation. This is a way of basically accelerating that cooperation in the way that the web understands. I'm very pleased to say that we've recently signed 5 major libraries up to basically experiment with this process. Each of them donating 1 million records to make them visible in the web, the way the web understands, and to accelerate the linking across them to test the needle in terms of their visibility and their impact, and the way that they, in fact, can change as an institution. So this isn't just a technical process. These initiatives never are. It is change management. It is strategy. It is awareness. It is education. It is systems. It is everything soup to nuts. It is an experiment. It's not a product. It's a step. And these folks have basically taken, put their hand up as to say, we're willing to take that step. Those steps are to make it incredibly simple and incredibly easy to start to take the existing data that they have and expose it in a way that the web understands. To increase the visibility of the web, of the assets that are currently hidden in the way the web understands. To build off not just the vocabularies, but the relationships among them. The vocabularies that we use to describe things are second to the links that connect them together. It is those links that we are accelerating. And it is those links that will increase discovery. And in the process, we will learn a lot. Now, what I talked about briefly is the things that basically are common among us. This is a few years ago I was at the Library of Congress, and we were fortunate enough to have the chief child librarian show us around, some really cool stuff. And I don't know if you can see this extraordinarily well. This is one of the original pop-up books. This is actually called a peep show. It's an accordion book. You look through a pinhole, and every step of the way, your eye basically gravitates to more and more interesting, richer stories. So it literally is a static display, but your mind, as it sort of goes down each one of these levels, tells an increasingly interesting story. And it's a fascinating, I've never even heard of this thing before, and it's just a great thing. My kids went back on this trip to Washington and told everybody they went to Washington and saw a peep show. It was the most enjoyable thing to them. And they were so excited, and every teacher sort of pulled me aside afterwards and said, "Excuse me?" But it is such an interesting, special, unique asset. Every library we've talked to has a lot of things that are common. And I have everything that is, and then they have all these other things that are unique. All these things that are special. All these things that touch the community or neighborhood they serve. This is about not just increasing the things that we have in common, but in fact connecting those things that make us special to those things that have in common to raise the increased awareness. Right now we have been focusing tremendously on how do we surface books and various different things that we know how to do on the web. But it's this long tail of special collections that we believe actually, by connecting into these common substrates, will increase the visibility. The Princeton University has the entire F. Scott Fitzgerald collection of The Great Gatsby. I would love to be able to not only find The Great Gatsby near me, but to then be informed that Princeton has all of this information about F. Scott Fitzgerald, the original manuscript, his typewriter, the Garot painting that was part of the front cover of his book. The number of people that know the Princeton Library has the F. Scott Fitzgerald collection now consists of this auditorium and maybe like a few more. Okay? We can do more. We have to do more. Not only to surface our assets we have, but to help people understand all of the things that we have that make us special. How do we make this happen? Go to libhub.org. As an individual, you could basically say, look, I just think this is a great idea. As a library, if you're interested in participating, there's ways that we'll step you through. If you're a vendor, there's ways in which you can offer your support. And in fact, in the next couple of weeks, keep coming back to that because we're about to basically make a pretty major announcement around the vendor space that are helping make this in fact possible. As we think about going forward, rethink collectively our role in making memory organizations part of not just the web, but of credibility engines of the web. We have more credible assets hidden than we know. And as somebody that's been working in the past 20 years in the intersection between libraries, data, and the web, the opportunity from a web perspective of having access to these credible resources is just enormous. And the opportunity from a library perspective of surfacing these credible resources in a way that the web can find them, and the web users can discover them, and the web can drive traffic, foot, gate, and otherwise to my physical environment is just a wonderful thing. Learn about the visible and invisible webs. Learn about what's happening in schema.org. Learn about what's happening in BibFrame, and participate. One of the things that basically, skin in the game is an important part of making this happen. From the DCMI going forward, two things are very clear as we work towards making the visible web and invisible web, come together. These application profiles are critical. There's no place right now where the social discussions can basically take place to make these happen. We need that safe, neutral, social infrastructure to make that possible. I think DCMI can serve a very important role in these, as well as the micro-language linked data patterns. Making it easy to connect to our assets is a key part of this. Right now, we don't have any consistency among our authority services. As just one of many examples, bringing those stakeholders together and trying to come up with that, I think would be a wildly useful and helpful way of making it more and more possible to start linking things together. Every step Every journey becomes with a first step, or in the particular case of this group, a hallway conversation. You know? We are taking that first step together. This is just getting off the ground. But, you know, our hope is this is an important first step, and then in the next 20 years, we'll look back on this and say, why did it take us so long? Because we have so much to offer. And it's just too important not to have that data available to the people that could benefit from it. So, I'm over my time and coffee is now being served, but thank you very much.
Thank you, Eric, and thank you all for being here for the conference. And I think Eric has provided us plenty to work on while we're here. So, coffee is outside. Please enjoy, and regular sessions will start shortly.